The late summer sun spilled across the Wyoming plains like a secret whispered by the earth, turning every ridge into a silhouette of mystery and every stretch of dust into a veil that hid something waiting to be uncovered. Caleb Ward, a man carved by silence and scarred by war, guided his horse slowly along the dry creek bed. His eyes, weathered and steady, moved across the ground in search of a stray yearling. But it wasn't the missing animal that fate had placed in his path that day. It was something far more fragile, something destined to change his solitude forever. The sound reached him first. Iron clashing against iron, the sharp rattle of chains dragged mercilessly across stone, and the uneven shuffle of feet forced to follow. Caleb reined in his horse, his instincts thrumming like an old wound reopening. From a low rise, he saw it clearly. 2 drunken men on a wagon, bottles glinting in the fading light, and behind them, stumbling and choking in the dust, was a woman bound in chains. Her wrists bled with every jolt of the iron links, her torn dress barely covering her bruised skin, her dark hair tangled in the cruel wind. She wasn't a prisoner of law, nor a thief deserving trial. She was being treated like less than human, dragged as though her suffering was some twisted sport. Caleb's chest tightened. He had told himself long ago that he was finished with violence, finished with the madness of drawing guns over every cruelty this land birthed. Yet standing by, doing nothing, would wound him deeper than any bullet ever could. He had seen war turn men into monsters. He had once looked away, and he had never forgiven himself for it. Not again. Not today. He nudged his horse forward, calm but resolute, the rhythm of hooves carrying him toward a confrontation he hadn't sought. The wagon men spotted him and sneered, mocking his quiet presence. They thought him a simple rancher with no fight left, an easy shadow they could brush aside. But Caleb planted his boots in the dirt, voice low and steady, commanding them with words sharp as steel. He told them to cut her loose. They laughed, they raised rifles, but he didn't flinch. His knife found the chain, sparks scraping as metal met metal, until at last the iron snapped free and clattered into the dust. The woman stumbled forward, breath ragged, wrists raw and trembling. She lifted her head just enough for Caleb to see her eyes, dark, guarded, but burning with a fragile light. A plea she didn't have to voice. "Nia," she whispered, her voice cracked with thirst and pain. Caleb repeated it, grounding her name in the earth between them, as if saying it alone could shield her from the memory of chains. The wagon rolled away, curses thrown into the wind, but Caleb didn't move until the dust of their retreat settled into silence. He turned then, his coat already sliding from his shoulders, wrapping it around Nia with a tenderness that felt both protective and strangely healing. Her body shook beneath the weight of exhaustion, yet her presence struck him with an intensity he couldn't name. Here, in the midst of the barren flats, was not just a stranger he had freed, but a soul who carried the same scars of survival, carved deep by cruelty and silence. He guided her toward his cabin, step by step, her bare feet blistered but moving with stubborn strength. The world around them grew softer as the sun sank lower, painting the horizon in hues of fire and rose. Neither spoke, but the quiet between them was not empty. It was alive, fragile threads of trust, weaving themselves in the space where despair had nearly won. By the time the cabin door groaned open, The scent of pine and the faint glow of firelight promised not just shelter, but the beginning of something unknown. Inside, Nia's gaze wandered across the small, tidy space. Rough-hewn table, shelves lined with jars, and a bunk waiting by the wall. She stood there like a bird, unsure if its wings could bear the sky again. Caleb, watching her silently, understood without words. She needed time, warmth, and the simple assurance that not all hands in this world were cruel. He stoked the fire, set bread and honey before her, and said nothing more than what mattered. Eat, heal, breathe. And so began the fragile, trembling thread that would slowly bind two lives together, not with chains of iron, but with choice, with trust, with the quiet power of love taking root where pain had once lived. If this story touches a quiet place in your heart, let it stay with you. And if you find comfort in this journey, I gently invite you to like this chapter, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to walk with us further. Every gesture, no matter how small, helps this healing tale continue to unfold. For sometimes, in the warmth of a story, we find not only love, but pieces of our own soul returning to light. And as night deepened around the cabin, Caleb kept watch while Nia drifted into sleep. The fire burned steady, the silence no longer heavy with loneliness. Outside, the land stretched vast and uncertain, but inside something had begun, something tender, something enduring, something worth protecting. Tomorrow would bring questions, chores, and shadows from the past. But tonight there was quiet, and the promise of a bond neither of them could yet name, waiting to grow in the hush of the Wyoming plains. The morning broke grey and soft, with mist curling low across the grass outside the cabin. Caleb stirred first, habit pulling him from sleep before the light had fully touched the horizon. He moved with the quiet of a man used to solitude, boots pulled on, rifle checked, the door unbarred. Yet as he stepped outside, he found his thoughts circling back to the fragile figure asleep in his bunk. Nia, wrapped beneath the quilt, had not tossed or cried out in the night. Her breath had been steady, though her body still seemed to hold the memory of chains even in rest. He had listened longer than he meant to, not from suspicion, but from a need he didn't understand, as if keeping watch over her breathing was an unspoken vow. The air carried the chill of dawn, the frost silvering the corral rails. Caleb scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing, searching for signs of the wagon men doubling back. The land stretched endless, pale and silent. For now, there was no threat, only the ordinary sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the gelding nosing at hay. He allowed himself the smallest breath of relief before stepping back inside. The fire had died to embers, and the cabin was hushed, the kind of hush that feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. Nia stirred as he closed the door. She sat up slowly, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders, her hair falling loose over her face. The morning light softened her features, though the shadows of exhaustion still clung to her eyes. Caleb busied himself with the skillet, laying strips of bacon over the iron and setting water to boil. He did not comment on her rising. Instead, he placed a cup of coffee and a plate of bread within reach. His words were few but steady. "Eat while it's warm. You'll need strength." She hesitated, glancing at him, then reached carefully, fingers trembling, as though she wasn't certain food would stay before her long. The way she ate, slow at first, then quicker with sudden hunger, struck him harder than he expected. It wasn't greed, it was survival. Caleb kept his gaze low, giving her dignity in the act, but something in his chest tightened. No one should have to eat like that. When her voice came, it was quiet, but clear. "What will you do with me now?" She didn't look at him when she asked, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup. Caleb leaned on the table, considering. He hadn't thought beyond the moment he cut her free. He only knew he couldn't let her be dragged another mile. "I won't turn you out," he said after a pause. "Not in the shape you're in. You'll stay here until you've healed. After that, the choice is yours." Her gaze lifted sharply at that. The word choice seemed to weigh more than the bread in her hands. She studied him as though waiting for a hidden demand, but none came. Slowly, she nodded, her shoulders easing the smallest measure. She wasn't used to freedom. It was written in every guarded line of her body. But the promise of choice, even fragile, was something healing. Through the day, the rhythm of work filled the cabin. Caleb patched rails on the fence, his hammer steady, the sound echoing across the yard. Nia tried to help, sweeping dust from the floor, carrying water to the basin, folding blankets with care. Her steps were unsteady, her wrists raw, but she worked without complaint. Once, when she stumbled in the yard, Caleb instinctively stepped closer, his hand half raised. But he didn't touch her. He let her steady herself. She noticed, her lips tightening, then softening just enough for a fleeting smile, the first hint of light across her guarded expression. At sundown, he brought in an old shirt, folded and set it on the bunk. "This might fit better than that torn dress," he said, voice plain. "At least until I get to town." She touched the fabric, her fingers lingering. For a moment she looked as though she might refuse out of pride or suspicion, but instead she slipped it beneath the ruined dress, tying his coat tighter around her. It wasn't much, but it covered the shame of rags. That night they sat by the fire, the lamplight low, silence stretching not heavy, but tentative. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands, and across from him, Nia brushed her tangled hair loose with her fingers. For the first time, he saw her not as a figure broken in chains, but as a woman, thin, bruised, yet unyielding. When she asked in a quiet voice if the men would return, he looked into the fire a long moment before answering. "Men like that don't forget. But if they do, I'll be ready. You're not theirs anymore." Her eyes lifted, holding his gaze. There was no thank you in her words, no plea, just the steady glimmer of someone finding ground beneath her feet again. That look carried more weight than any vow. The fire burned lower, the night folding around the cabin. Caleb unrolled his bed near the hearth, his rifle close as always. Nia lay in the bunk, her breath evening out in the quiet. The distance between them was filled not with fear, but with a fragile peace, a rhythm that felt almost like the first stirrings of home. For the first time in years, Caleb did not feel the press of loneliness against his chest. Instead, he felt the faint pulse of something healing, something new, rising with the warmth of the fire and the presence of another soul under his roof. Morning would bring new questions, perhaps new dangers, but tonight there was bread, firelight, and the fragile trust of two lives crossing, and though neither spoke it, both knew. This was only the beginning. The frost lingered longer than the sun promised, a thin sheet of silver clinging to the grass and the trough outside the cabin. Caleb rose before light, as he always did, the habit of years in solitude carved into his bones, but now, when he turned from the door, he was not met by emptiness. Nia was already awake, sitting quietly near the hearth, her hair falling loose over her shoulders, her body wrapped in his coat. She had tended the fire while he stepped outside, the flames steady and bright, a fragile offering of warmth to the house that had never known another's hands. For a moment he simply watched her, and in that stillness something unfamiliar pressed against his chest. Not pity, not duty, but the quiet knowledge that he no longer lived entirely alone. She looked up as he came inside, uncertain if she had overstepped by rising first. But Caleb only nodded once, his way of saying without words that her presence was not intrusion, but welcome. He set beans to simmer on the stove, the smell softening the chill, and she moved quietly to place cups on the table. She acted as though she expected correction, as if any step could be judged, but his silence granted her space. It was a silence that healed rather than weighed heavy, and she seemed to feel it too. After breakfast, he gathered his tools, the hammer and nails heavy in his hands, the day's work waiting along the fence line. Nia stood in the doorway, watching him with eyes that carried questions unspoken. Finally she asked, her voice low, "Why do you live here alone?" Caleb paused, leaning back on his heels, the wind tugging at his coat. He hadn't expected the question so soon, yet it came as natural as breath. He told her of his brother, who hadn't returned from the war, of the comrades he had buried, of the land he had chosen not for prosperity, but for the quiet it gave. He did not speak of all the ghosts, but enough that she understood. Her gaze lingered on him, steady, not with pity, but with the kind of recognition that comes from someone who also carried loss. She asked no more, yet the silence that followed was not empty. It carried the weight of trust, fragile and tentative, but real. She swept the cabin floor while he mended the fence, her steps slow but determined, as if proving to herself she could still move forward. At times she faltered, the weakness of her body reminding them both of the chains she had endured. Caleb's hand lifted once, instinctively ready to steady her, but he let it hover instead, giving her the dignity to right herself. She noticed, and when she managed a faint smile, it was the first true softness he had seen touch her face. By sundown, he returned with an old shirt folded beneath his arm. He placed it on the bunk, plain words masking the careful thought behind them. "Might fit you better than that dress. At least for now." She traced the fabric with her fingers, something in her throat tightening as though she had forgotten what it was to be given without demand. She slipped it on beneath the rags, and when she stood by the firelight, sleeves rolled past her wrists, it was as though a small piece of her dignity had been restored. That night, the cabin filled with a warmth not entirely from the fire. They sat across from each other, the lamplight soft, her hair falling loose as she combed it with careful fingers. Caleb, quiet as ever, felt his chest tighten with an awareness he hadn't wanted to admit. She was still fragile, still bruised, but there was strength in the way she held herself. She asked then, almost a whisper, if the men would return. He stared into the flames before answering. "Men like that don't forgive. But if they come, I'll be here. You're not theirs anymore." Her gaze met his, unflinching, a depth of gratitude in her silence more binding than any vow. It wasn't thanks she offered, but trust. The kind of trust that grows not from words, but from the steady presence of someone who chooses to stay. When the fire dimmed and the cabin folded into night, Caleb stretched out on his bedroll near the hearth, his rifle within reach as always. Nia lay in the bunk, the quilt drawn close, her breath evening into the quiet. Yet the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was gentler, carrying the soft rhythm of two lives beginning to move in step. For Caleb, the cabin did not feel so hollow. For Nia, the air did not feel so cruel. The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of pine through the chinks in the boards, and for the first time in years, the night did not press down on Caleb like exile. It held instead the fragile promise of something tender, something healing, something that would grow. And though neither dared to speak it, they both felt it in the hush of the firelight. This was the start of a bond neither chains nor silence could break. Tomorrow would bring new work, new questions, perhaps shadows of danger lingering still on the horizon. But tonight, in the glow of the hearth, there was the beginning of trust, the stirrings of hope, and the quiet unfolding of love not yet named, but already taking root. The days settled into a rhythm that neither of them had expected, a rhythm that seemed to breathe healing into the quiet walls of the cabin. Caleb worked the land with his steady patience, mending fence rails, checking the herd, hauling wood from the ridge, while Nia moved with slower steps but no less determination, folding blankets, sweeping the floor, carrying water from the creek. Each act was small, ordinary, but together they wove a pattern that filled the silence not with emptiness but with life. The cabin, once a hollow shell of solitude, began to carry the soft weight of presence, the sense of two souls moving gently into each other's space. At first, Nia flinched at the creak of the door or the sudden bark of a cow in the distance. Shadows lingered in her, scars that no fire could burn away in a single night, but Caleb never hurried her healing. He did not press with questions. He offered space, warmth, and the unspoken promise that she was safe here. Over time, her breaths came easier. The rawness in her gaze softened into something steadier, and each day she seemed to reclaim a small piece of herself that had been stolen. One morning, frost still veiled the earth when Caleb brought a calf in from the pasture, its slick body shivering, borne too close to the snowdrifts. He wrapped it in his coat and carried it into the cabin, where Nia hurried to spread towels by the fire. Together they rubbed the newborn until its cries grew louder, its tiny legs kicking against the floorboards. The sight drew something unexpected from her lips. A laugh, light and sudden, so unguarded that Caleb froze, his hands stilling on the calf's side. He had not heard her laugh before. The sound startled him more than the storm winds that shook the roof at night. For a moment the cabin filled not only with warmth, but with something that reached beyond survival, joy. She caught his gaze and quickly turned away, embarrassed by the sound she had let slip. But Caleb carried it with him long after, replaying it in the quiet moments, as if that single laugh had stitched a tear in the fabric of his own silence. From that day he noticed how she moved differently, shoulders less bent beneath unseen weight, steps steadier, as though she had remembered what it meant to belong somewhere. In the evenings, after the chores were finished, they sat by the fire in a hush that grew more comfortable with each passing night. Caleb mended bridles or oiled his rifle, his hands steady with habit, while Nia sewed patches into the shirt she wore, her fingers threading needle and cloth with quiet care. Sometimes their hands brushed as they reached across the table for the same spool of thread or tin of coffee. At first, Caleb would pull back quickly, wary of breaking the fragile line between them. But Nia's hand often lingered where his had been, a subtle invitation that spoke more than words. One night, the The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters until Caleb climbed onto the table to hammer them firm. When his hand slipped and blood streaked across his knuckles, Nia was there before he could wave it off. She held his hand in hers, small fingers steady as she wrapped cloth around the wound. The moment pressed close, her touch warm against his calloused skin, her face bent in concentration. Caleb watched her, startled by the tenderness, the practiced certainty of her movements, as if she had mended not only her own pain, but others before. For a moment, the storm outside faded. Later, as the fire burned low, Nia spoke softly, her eyes on the flames. "When they chained me, I thought I would die before anyone cared enough to stop it." Caleb's jaw tightened. He let the silence stretch before answering, his voice low. "I've seen men walk past worse. I was one of them once. Not this time." The words carried weight, not just confession, but promise. Nia turned, meeting his eyes. There was no desperation in her gaze now, only steady gratitude. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his cheek. Caleb hesitated only a moment, then kissed her, slow and deliberate, a touch both cautious and certain. She answered without retreat, her hand rising to his chest, resting there as though she had finally found ground firm enough to stand on. When they parted, neither spoke, but the silence between them was transformed. It was no longer guarded, no longer fragile. It was alive, humming with something new. That night they lay close beneath the same quilt by the fire, their bodies meeting not with haste, but with care, every touch a question and every answer given freely. For Nia, it was not surrender, but choice. For Caleb, it was not possession, but reverence. The intimacy between them carried not desperation, but healing, the tender rebirth of trust and desire. By morning, the storm had broken, leaving the earth washed clean beneath the pale sun. Caleb rose quietly, covering her with the quilt as she stirred in her sleep. He stepped outside to check the yard, his breath clouding in the cool air. The corral stood firm, the herd safe, the cabin walls still strong. Nothing had changed in the world beyond the door, yet inside, everything had. The loneliness that had once been the marrow of his days was no longer absolute. He was no longer the man who turned away from cruelty, nor the man who lived only for fences and cattle. He had chosen and been chosen in return. When he came back inside, Nia was already awake, brushing her hair with the bone comb he had given her. The quilt still wrapped around her, but her eyes held something new. Light, fragile, but steady. She looked at him not as a stranger, not as her rescuer, but as a man she had chosen to stay beside. And in that look, Caleb found more healing than any fire could give. The days that followed carried a fragile peace. They worked side by side, spoke little, and shared silence that grew warmer with every hour. Yet beneath the quiet, both knew shadows lingered on the horizon. The men who had chained her would not forget, and though the threat was still distant, the bond they had built was no longer one of chance. It was a bond they would defend together. And as the sun set across the wide Wyoming flats, painting the sky in hues of fire and rose, Caleb looked at Nia and knew. The beginning had already taken root, and nothing, neither storms nor shadows, could undo it now. Spring crept across the land with a quiet persistence, the snow receding from the ridges, the earth softening beneath the weight of thaw. The river swelled with meltwater, carrying away the silence of winter. For Caleb and Nia, life began to fold into a rhythm that felt both fragile and unshakably new. Morning light found them together in the cabin, the scent of coffee and wood smoke mingling with the sound of ordinary work. He mended bridles or checked the herd. She swept the floor, stacked wood near the door, and sewed with the thread Maddie Crane had gifted her. Each small act stitched a home from the rough edges of survival, turning loneliness into belonging. One evening, as the lamp burned low, Nia brushed her hair loose with slow strokes, the strands spilling like dark silk over her shoulders. Caleb sat across the table, his hands steady on the rifle he oiled, but his eyes drawn to her in moments he didn't mean to let linger. The silence was filled with warmth, not caution. It was no longer the hush of strangers or the quiet of distrust, but the soft rhythm of two lives finding comfort in shared space. When their hands touched over the table, her fingers brushing his as she reached for the spool of thread, neither pulled back quickly. She let her touch rest, just long enough for Caleb to meet her eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, steady and certain, a promise neither had voiced, but both had already chosen. The bond deepened not with declarations, but with moments. When Caleb cut a new rail for the fence, she carried nails in her palms, offering them as though she had always belonged in the rhythm of his work. When she stumbled over the uneven ground, his hand hovered close, ready, but never forcing, giving her the strength to find her balance. The smallest of gestures built a trust that was stronger than any vow. At night, they sat together by the fire, closer now than before, the warmth of their shoulders brushing as naturally as breath. Caleb listened to her voice when she spoke of the land she had come from, the desert wind, the fields near San Carlos, the memory of her mother teaching her to sew before the chains had stolen everything. He said little in return, but the weight of his silence was not empty. It was attentive, carrying her words as though they were precious. In her stories, he heard not only pain, but life returning piece by piece, healing her voice in the telling. When the storm returned one evening, slamming against the cabin walls and rattling the shutters, Caleb braced the beams while Nia held the lamp steady, her face illuminated in the trembling glow. When the hammer slipped and split his knuckles, she caught his hand quickly, guiding him to the table. She tore cloth with firm movements, binding the wound with care that came from practice, her touch sure and gentle. Caleb felt the heat of her hands linger long after, and when she finally lifted her gaze, their eyes locked in the hush of the storm. It was then that she leaned closer, not in fear, but in choice, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not hurried, not born of desperation, but of a trust carefully nurtured. Caleb's hand found her jaw, steady but tender, and she leaned into him, answering without hesitation. The world outside thundered, the roof groaned against the wind, but inside there was only the warmth of their closeness. When they drew apart, her forehead rested against his shoulder, her breath mingling with his, and the silence was full of something neither of them could deny. That night they lay together beneath the same quilt, their touches deliberate and reverent. The intimacy was not an escape from pain, but the gentle claiming of life and love after darkness. It was the healing of two souls who had long been denied the choice to hold or be held. By morning the storm had passed, sunlight breaking through the cracks in the shutters, spilling soft gold across the floorboards. Caleb rose first, pulling the quilt back over her shoulders when she stirred. He lingered for a moment, watching her chest rise and fall, his rough hands trembling with a tenderness he had not felt in years. When he stepped outside, the corral stood firm, the cattle safe, the land glistening as though washed clean. Yet he knew the true change was not in the world beyond the door, but in the cabin, where two hearts had quietly chosen each other. In the days that followed, they lived in a rhythm neither had expected. She swept dust from the floor while he patched rails, her laughter sometimes rising unbidden at the antics of a calf or the stubborn tilt of his hat. Each time her laughter came, it startled him, filling the air with a joy he had not known he craved. At night, when the fire burned low, she brushed her hair in the lamplight and sometimes reached across the table to touch his hand. Each touch said what words could not. She was not only surviving, she was choosing. And he, who had once lived only in silence, found his soul answering her choice with a steady, unspoken vow. Yet beneath the peace, they both knew shadows lingered. The men who had chained her would not have forgotten, and Caleb's eyes often swept the horizon for riders, his jaw tight with the memory of that day. Still, when Nia stood beside him in the yard, her chin lifted, her scars faint but visible against the light, he saw not fear, but strength. She was no longer a woman broken by cruelty. She was a woman standing in her own ground, and she had chosen to stand with him. The warmth of their days, the tenderness of their nights, and the healing laughter that returned piece by piece wove them closer together. And though the threat of the past loomed like a shadow at the edge of the plains, the bond they had built was not fragile. It was unyielding. Each sunrise carried the quiet promise that they were no longer two separate lives, but one story unfolding, written not in chains, but in love. And as the horizon burned red with the setting sun, Caleb knew with a certainty that filled his chest. Whatever darkness tried to return, they would face it together. The thaw of spring gave way to early summer, the wide flats shimmering beneath the heat. The cabin, once a shelter of silence, had become something more. A place where breath and laughter mingled with the crackle of fire, where trust grew stronger than the walls themselves. Caleb and Nia moved in rhythm, each day weaving their lives tighter together, their silence no longer a weight but a comfort. Yet as the season ripened, the shadow of the past crept nearer, carried on the dust of approaching riders. It began with a shape on the horizon, 5 figures moving steady toward the corral. Caleb noticed first, his hand tightening on the rail as the dust trailed behind the horses like smoke. His stomach clenched, but his face betrayed nothing. He had expected this moment, though he had wished it further away. When he stepped into the cabin, Nia read the truth in his eyes before he spoke. "They're here," he said simply. She froze, then straightened, the memory of chains flashing across her face before being buried beneath a firmer resolve. She stood, her hand reaching for the Henry rifle near the door, her fingers curling around the stock as though reclaiming not only a weapon, but her own ground. Caleb shook his head, his voice low, protective. "No one's putting you in their sights." But she lifted her chin, her eyes burning with something steadier than fear. "And no one will make me hide." For a moment, Silence stretched between them, the fire crackling low. Then Caleb gave a slow nod. "Stay close." The riders circled into the yard, dust swirling around the horses' hooves. The leader, a hard-eyed man with a scar across his jaw, spat into the dirt and leaned forward in his saddle. "Told you we'd be back. She's ours." Caleb stepped forward, his hands empty but steady at his sides, his voice calm, carrying the weight of a man who had seen death too many times to mistake bluster for power. "Not anymore." The man sneered, his hand hovering near his rifle. "Law don't care what you think. We got claim." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Bring law, then. Sheriff will take your names, same as I will. But if you reach for that gun, I'll bury you here, myself." The words dropped heavy into the yard, the silence that followed sharper than any blade. Before the leader could spit another threat, the cabin door opened. Nia stepped out, the Henry cradled against her arms, her eyes fixed on the men who had once dragged her in chains. Her scars caught the sunlight, faint but undeniable, testimony carved into flesh. She spoke only one word, but it cut deeper than any curse. "No." The quiet that followed was staggering. The riders had not expected her to stand, much less speak. The wind tugged at coats, horses shifted uneasily, and for the first time the men's certainty faltered. They were not looking at a broken captive anymore, but at a woman who had chosen her place, standing beside the man who had freed her. Caleb felt her presence like a force at his side, steady as stone, her refusal carrying more weight than a rifle's barrel. One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle, unease plain on his face. "Ain't worth it," he muttered, glancing toward the others. The leader shot him a glare, but hesitation spread like cracks in dry ground. They were no longer facing a silent woman bound in chains. They were facing two people bound by choice, a bond stronger than fear. Finally, the leader spat again, trying to force menace into his tone. "This ain't finished." Caleb's voice was quiet, but cold enough to cut the air. "Then bring it finished, but not today." The riders turned, one by one, pulling their horses back. Dust rose around them as they rode off, thinner in their threats than in their entry. Caleb did not move until the sound of hooves faded into the horizon. Only then did he lower his shoulders, the tension loosening from his chest. Nia's hands shook as she set the rifle on the table inside, but her chin remained high, her eyes still fierce. Caleb reached out, his hand covering hers. His voice, low and steady, carried no demand. "You don't owe me thanks." Her gaze met his, unflinching. "I wasn't thanking you. I was telling you. I'm not afraid of them anymore." The words struck him harder than he expected. For weeks she had carried silence heavy as iron, her body bent under the weight of memory. Now she was standing, not just beside him, but with him, and though the threat lingered, though the men might yet return with law at their back, Caleb knew the battle that mattered most had already been fought and won. That night the fire glowed warm against the dark, casting their faces in quiet light. Caleb sat awake longer than usual, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath from the bunk. He kept his rifle near, the habit of caution unchanged, but in his chest something different stirred. The silence no longer carried loneliness. It carried the strength of two souls who had chosen to face the storm together. And in that choice, the cabin ceased to be only a shelter. It had become the beginning of a home. The horizon might bring more riders, more shadows, more battles, but as Caleb glanced once more at Naya, her body wrapped in the quilt, her face softened by sleep, he knew with a quiet certainty that whatever came, they would meet it side by side. The healing had already begun, and there was no turning back. 2 days after the riders had vanished in a cloud of dust, a different wagon appeared on the horizon, its pace steady, carrying no menace but something heavier, judgment. Caleb spotted it from the yard, his chest tightening as the sun struck the badge pinned to Sheriff Lyle's coat. Beside him sat Mattie Crane, her weathered face unreadable beneath her bonnet. This visit was not a raid nor a threat. It was the law itself, coming to measure the truth. The sheriff dismounted with the slow ease of a man accustomed to long roads. He was broad-shouldered, grey, streaking his hair, the weight of years settling in his eyes. "Ward," he said, his voice calm, but lined with authority. "Heard talk in town about some men causing trouble. Figured best to hear it from you." Caleb stood firm, his boots planted in the dirt, and gave the names one by one, his voice steady, each syllable a stone laid bare. He spoke of finding Nia chained to the wagon, of cutting her free, of their return with rifles raised. He did not dress the words with anger, only the plain weight of truth. Then Nia stepped forward from the doorway. She carried no weapon now, only the courage that had grown in her chest since the day she whispered, "No." The scars on her wrists caught the light as she lifted her hands. "They treated me as property," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I am not property. I will testify." The words fell into the yard like seeds into good soil, taking root in the silence that followed. Sheriff Lyle nodded, pulling a folded sheet from his coat. "That's enough for warrants. 3 of them already picked up near the stockyards. The other 2 won't get far." His tone was matter-of-fact, but his eyes carried respect. Before he left, the sheriff turned to her once more. "You're free here. No man can claim you. If they say otherwise, the law will prove different." He tipped his hat to her, then mounted his horse. Mattie Crane lingered behind, stepping down from the wagon with a bundle in her hands. She pressed it into Nia's palms. Ribbon, more thread, and a small sack of sugar wrapped in cloth. "High come summer," she said softly, her half-smile lined with years. Nia's throat tightened. She could only manage 2 words. "Thank you." But her eyes shimmered with a gratitude too deep for speech. When the wagon rolled away, the yard was quiet again, but the silence was changed. Nia turned the ribbon over in her hands, her expression unsteady. "I don't understand why she would give me this." Caleb's voice was steady, his gaze firm. "Because she sees you the way I do, not as what you've been through, but as who you are now." That evening, when the lamplight painted the cabin in gold, Caleb set something on the table. It was small, hammered silver, polished from an old coin he had carried for years. His shoulders were stiff, his voice low. "I don't have preacher talk or fine words, but I don't want to go back to being alone, and I don't want you to walk this world alone either. Will you stay with me as my wife?" Nia's breath caught. For a moment, silence pressed between them, heavy with memory, heavy with choice. Then she reached across the table, her fingers closing over his rough hand, her voice steady, clear as the firelight. "Yes, I choose this." The courthouse was plain, its walls smelling of ink and paper. Sheriff Lyle signed as witness, his hand firm on the page, while Mattie Crane stood as second, her smile quiet but proud. The stamp of the clerk sealed the bond, the ink spelling out their names, Caleb Ward and Nia Ward. They stood on the courthouse steps afterward, close for the photograph. A rancher in his good coat, a woman in her calico dress with ribbon in her hair. The flash burned, catching not chains or bruises, but the strength of two people who had walked through fire and chosen love. When they returned to the cabin, it no longer felt like walls holding back the world. It felt like the heart of something new. Together they planted beans behind the shed, hauled water from the creek, and mended fences side by side. At night they shared bread at the table, her ring catching the lamplight each time she reached for his hand. The scars on her wrists remained, but they no longer spoke of chains. They spoke of survival, of resilience, of a life reclaimed. The land stretched wide and uncertain, storms still gathered at the edges of the horizon, but within the cabin there was a warmth stronger than any threat. They were no longer bound by silence, nor haunted by fear. They were bound by choice, by healing, by the quiet certainty that the love they had chosen would stand as firm as the earth beneath their feet. And as the summer sun dipped low, turning the sky into fire and rose, Nia rested her head against Caleb's shoulder, his arm steady around her. The world was not done with its storms, but neither were they done with their courage. What awaited them would come in time. For now, there was only the softness of evening, the gentle rhythm of hearts finally at peace, and the promise of love that would not falter. The summer came golden and alive, pressing its warmth deep into the Wyoming soil. Days stretched long, the skies clear, the river running full with the melt of distant peaks. Life, once fragile and uncertain, settled into a harmony that felt almost timeless. Caleb and Nia rose each morning together, the cabin no longer echoing with solitude, but filled with the steady rhythm of shared living. He tended the cattle, his hands rough with work, while she kept the hearth alive, sewing, mending, shaping the cabin into a home that felt touched by gentleness. It was no longer a shelter from storms. It was their place in the world, carved from hardship, bound with love. Nia wore the calico dress often, not from vanity, but because it carried the memory of her first step into town as a free woman, her chin lifted against stares that once would have broken her. Now she walked with grace, her scars not hidden, but carried as proof of survival. Caleb's eyes followed her in quiet awe, the kind of gaze that held no possession, only reverence. He had lived years without believing he would ever see such light again. Yet here it was, moving across the cabin, filling the air with warmth. Evenings were their truest hours. After work, they would sit side by side on the porch, the horizon painted in fire by the setting sun. Sometimes silence spoke for them, carrying more comfort than words. Other times, Nia would tell him of her childhood, memories of her mother's voice singing by the fire, of learning to weave with nimble fingers, of fields where she once gathered herbs for healing. She spoke with a softness that made the past bloom again, and Caleb listened with the steady patience of a man who knew every word was a gift. He shared little, but enough, about his brother, about battles he no longer glorified, about the weight of survival when too many others had not. She did not turn from his truths. Instead, She reached for his hand, and with her touch, those memories softened, no longer burning, but healing. In her presence, even his silence felt redeemed. When storms swept in again, rattling the shutters and pressing rain against the roof, they braced the walls together, their hands meeting on the beam as they forced it into place. They laughed when the wind shrieked through the cracks, their voices rising louder than the storm. When the danger passed, they sat close by the fire, shoulders pressed together, the storm outside no longer something to fear, but something to face side by side. Love, once tentative, now flowed with the certainty of the river, quiet, powerful, unstoppable. In town, people began to look at Nia differently, not as a stranger, not as a shadow, but as the woman who stood unbroken, her head high beside Caleb Ward. Mattie Crane often found excuses to offer small kindnesses, ribbon, flower, the sort of gifts that said wordlessly, "You belong." And when Nia began to stitch dresses from bolts of cloth she had slowly collected, Mattie was the first to wear one, telling others that Nia's hands had talent worth treasuring. The threads she sewed were not just fabric. They were strands of dignity, weaving her into the life of the community. By late summer, the cabin was alive in ways Caleb had never imagined. Rows of beans grew behind the shed, wildflowers gathered in a clay pot on the table, and the sound of Nia's laughter spilled into the yard. Evenings carried the smell of bread baking, mingling with the scent of pine smoke. Caleb sometimes paused in his work, simply watching her move across the room, his chest tightening with a fullness he could not put into words. She had not only healed her own wounds, she had mended the hollow in him that had seemed endless. Their love was not a blaze of sudden fire, but the steady flame of a hearth, warm, healing, unyielding. They chose each other every day, in every glance, in every silence, in every hand that lingered too long on the table. The cabin that once stood as a lonely outpost had become a sanctuary, not because of its walls, but because of the hearts within it. As autumn whispered its first breath across the plains, they stood together at the edge of their land, the horizon wide before them. Caleb's arm rested around her shoulders, her head leaned against him. The wind carried the promise of cooler days, but neither felt the chill. The world beyond still held storms and shadows, but they had found the strength to face them together. Chains had been broken, silence had been healed, and in its place a love had been forged that would endure every season to come. And if this story has stirred something in your heart, if you felt the warmth of their journey, the healing of their love, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to like this chapter, and to subscribe for more. Every small gesture helps keep these stories alive, carrying their light into the quiet corners where someone may need it most. For love, once shared, has the power to heal not just the ones who lived it, but all of us who carry its flame forward.